My parents told me to start paying rent or move out on my 18th birthday, but my bold choice sparked consequences they never imagined. I turned 18 about 10 days ago, and on the day of my 18th birthday, instead of throwing me a party like normal parents, my parents decided to sit me down and tell me that I needed to start paying rent if I still wanted to live in their house. I didn't understand why they were so hellbent on making me pay rent because they'd never talked about these things before. My relationship with my parents has always been strained, to the point where calling it a relationship feels generous. As a child, my basic needs were met: food, shelter, clothing, but there was no warmth or connection. Conversations were rare, and affection or love from them was non-existent, leaving me to grow up feeling emotionally distant. Presently, our bond remains fragile at best. My mother, a high school English teacher, and my father, employed in marketing, earn a comfortable income, affording them a pleasant lifestyle. Yet, I've always sensed reluctance in their spending on me, as if providing for their only child was a duty they fulfilled grudgingly, not out of genuine care or desire to see me happy. This emotional disconnect shaped my independence early on, pushing me to rely on myself rather than seek their support. Despite their financial stability, their lack of enthusiasm for nurturing me left a lasting impression, reinforcing the emotional chasm between us. Just to be on the safe side, I decided to get a job in high school. It was just a job as an intern at a nearby office supply store, but it paid decently, and I could manage it alongside school, so I had no complaints. I had even saved up some money for myself. I wouldn't say that I had enough to move out, but I could at least cover rent for the first couple of months if I stayed somewhere extremely cheap or split it with roommates. I didn't know about the other costs, though. These were measures that I'd only taken for the worst-case scenario, but I didn't really think that I would actually have to end up utilizing this money so soon. On the day I turned 18, my parents delivered a shocking ultimatum: pay rent or leave their home. The demand stung deeply, as it felt like they'd been biding their time, waiting for me to reach legal adulthood just to push me out. The insult of their indifference was too much to bear, and I refused to stay in a place that constantly reminded me of their rejection. Fueled by anger and hurt, I packed my belongings and headed to a friend's house for the night. My parents made no effort to stop me, their silence confirming their lack of concern. I haven't returned since. The abruptness of their demand caught me off guard. While they'd always been reluctant to spend money on me, they'd never so blatantly tried to force me out. This cold detachment only deepened the emotional rift between us, solidifying my resolve to forge my own path forward. In the wake of my parents' ultimatum, my friend generously opened his home to me, offering a temporary refuge until I could secure an apartment or until college began in the fall. Fortunately, my maternal grandparents had established a college fund for me, untouchable by my parents, ensuring my tuition was covered. My father's parents, sadly, passed away when he was young. The sting of my parents' words fueled my anger, prompting me to block their numbers immediately after leaving, with no intention of reversing that decision. Though our relationship had always been distant, I had hoped they'd at least allow me to stay in their home until I could stand on my own financially. I understood they weren't legally obligated to support me as an adult, but their callousness cut deeply, amplifying the emotional chasm between us. The betrayal left me grappling with hurt, reinforcing my determination to rely on those who genuinely cared, like my friend and grandparents, as I navigated this painful transition. On the fourth day, I received a call from my grandparents, and they asked me to visit. I realized that they had no idea what had happened, so I visited them and told them everything. They'd always known that my parents weren't the most emotionally available people when it came to me, but they were livid when I told them about my parents insisting that I either pay rent or leave. They told me that it was outrageous and they couldn't accept behavior of this sort. They asked me to move in with them, like they had several times before, but I refused yet again because my grandparents were old, and I didn't want to be an extra burden on them. My grandpa had a furniture company, and they were pretty comfortable financially, so it wasn't that which I was worried about, but my grandpa was suffering from Parkinson's, and my grandma had enough to deal with as it is. I didn't want to pile on and add more to her plate. I knew that they would have loved to have me there with them, but I cared too much about my grandparents to impose my presence on them. Besides, now that I was an adult, I couldn't just rely on them for help, and I had to make something of myself for the future. That's why I refused to move in with them, which disappointed them a little, but they understood where I was coming from. For me, it was just good enough that they'd even offered to let me live with them because not a lot of people have that kind of heart, especially not the kind of people I grew up with, not my parents, for sure. They told me that I could ask them for whatever help I needed, and they'd be there for me, which meant a lot. I visited my grandparents at least once a week, but after that, I got kind of busy looking for apartments to move into because there were still a good few months to go before college started. Then, yesterday, I received a call from my parents. My dad was using his business number because that was the only one that I'd forgotten to block. When I answered the call, I realized that both my parents were on the line to talk to me. They informed me that my grandparents had decided to back out of an investment on account of what I told them, and now my parents were panicking because this was my father's business that he was going to start in a couple of months. My mother had convinced my grandpa with great difficulty to come on board as an investor, but as soon as he learned what my parents had said to me, he backed out of the deal. Apparently, my father's new business idea was also the reason he was asking me to pay rent, because then he would have another source of money as well and would end up saving a lot, so that money could eventually go into his business. Now, they wanted my grandpa to come back on board, and I was the only person who could manage that, so they wanted me to speak to him and bring him back. I told them that I wasn't going to do anything because this was their own fault. They'd been horrible to me, not just recently but for most of my life, and had made me feel like a burden literally constantly, so now they really had no right to expect anything of me. They dug their own grave, and now they had to lie in it. I was just about to disconnect the call when my mother told me how unfair and ungrateful I was being. She told me that all through my life, it had been them who had paid for everything, and now that I had a little money of my own, I was turning my back on them. They told me that this was apparently my fault somehow because they really hadn't considered that I would end up leaving and moving out. She told me that the only reason they even expected and asked me to pay rent was because I could afford to, and they knew it, and apparently, they weren't even going to ask me for much, but they didn't even get to the amount because I stormed off in such a rage. My mother almost started crying and told me that she knew they hadn't been the best parents, but that didn't mean that they didn't care for me, and the way I was acting right now made them feel as if they'd done something wrong. My dad told me that it was up to me what I wanted to do, but he reminded me that this business he was about to start was his dream project, and he would be shattered if it didn't come through only because they had asked me to do something as simple as pay rent, which was something a lot of parents all over the country do anyway without consequences. They told me to think about it and let them know within a week, and now I obviously feel like a horrible human being, and I have no idea what to do. Am I the asshole for moving out when my parents gave me an ultimatum to either move out or pay rent? Okay, so I don't think I'm going to go back and apologize to my parents like I was planning to. My emotions just got the better of me that day, I guess. Now that I've thought about things with a clearer head and also read the comments on my post, I don't really think that I owe it to them to go back, apologize, or speak to my grandparents to make everything right. I still have 2 days before I have to let them know about my decision, but I've already made up my mind, and I also know that they're not going to take this kindly. My mother was pretty emotional, but now that I think of it, the tears could have been faked just as easily. I couldn't see them, so who's to say if she was really crying or just pretending to cry so that I would feel bad? It sounds very cynical, but honestly, I don't trust my parents one bit, and it's not like they've done anything to remedy that situation. I haven't yet talked to my grandparents about this because I don't want to make it seem like I'm getting too involved in something that doesn't concern me. I have, however, discussed this situation with my friends, and they think that whatever I'm doing is completely justified. My parents were the ones who started this fight, so now they can't just shift the blame onto me and expect me to be okay with it. They need to take accountability for their own actions. So I have to tell my parents tomorrow about my decision, and today I decided to talk to my grandparents about this. I know I said that I was feeling good about my decision in the last update, but I feel like I have way too much of a conscience to just do this and not feel guilty about shattering my father's dreams. It's dramatic, I know, but that's exactly the way he put it. Now, I don't know if that was for effect or if he really feels that way about his new business. When I talked to my grandparents about that phone call with my parents, they told me that I had nothing to worry about or feel guilty about. They said that after they learned from me about the ultimatum, they'd already made up their minds to back out of the deal, and now nothing was going to change that. It wasn't just me, but there were a couple of other factors as well that had led to them stepping down as investors in the business. They didn't even trust my father and had only come on board because of my mother, but now even that trust has been broken. And you just can't build a business without trust. That helped me with the guilt because, either way, I couldn't have convinced my grandparents to come back on board with the deal, so this is technically really not my fault. It's their own. Today, I told my parents about my decision, and I don't know why I had even expected them to take it reasonably. I decided to break the news to them on the phone because I didn't want to risk more drama by turning up at their house. When I called them, my mother answered her phone, and she sounded really excited, so I decided not to give them any false hope by beating around the bush and told her straight away that I had decided not to talk to my grandparents and convince them to come back on board. I told them my reasons as well and made sure that they knew the entire truth so they couldn't delude themselves into believing that they were somehow not at fault here. There were about 1,000 different ways that they could have gone about the situation without insulting me and making me feel small for not wanting to pay rent. I told them that the real reason I'd even started working at the age of 16 was because of them, because I didn't feel safe enough to rely on them and trust them. I knew that at some point, they would want me out of their house, so I started working and saving up so I could move out at the earliest. They hadn't even bothered to think about college and set anything aside for me. I'm not saying that they were obliged to, but they were my parents, and they could afford to do so. All my friends' parents were paying for their tuition, and I was the only one who was relying on my grandparents for it. They'd never ever made me feel like I could count on them, be it financially or even emotionally. And to be fair, they'd given me the choice to move out, so I just took them up on their own offer, and now they couldn't complain about it. I didn't owe it to them to talk to my grandparents and clear the air between them. Why should it be my problem if my dad doesn't get to live out his dream of being a businessman when it wasn't his problem to think about where I would live if they demanded rent from me out of money that I was saving for my future? When I finished expressing everything I had been holding inside, my father's response cut deeper than I had anticipated. His voice was cold and filled with disappointment as he declared that I had become nothing more than a massive letdown to him. He expressed genuine regret about even attempting to have this conversation with me, having foolishly hoped that I might demonstrate some level of maturity and reasonableness in handling this delicate family matter. The weight of his words grew heavier as he confessed that he felt like an absolute failure as a parent, convinced that he had somehow managed to raise what he described as an egoistic and completely self-centered individual. According to him, witnessing my current behavior brought him more shame than anything else he could possibly imagine experiencing in his lifetime. Perhaps it was petty of me, but something inside me snapped, and I felt compelled to escalate the confrontation even further. With a tone that I knew would sting, I told my father that he shouldn't burden himself with feelings of shame or failure regarding how I had turned out. After all, I pointed out with deliberate cruelty, he hadn't actually raised me to become this way because, truthfully speaking, he hadn't raised me at all throughout my childhood. This observation seemed to be the final straw that pushed him completely over the edge of rational discourse. In a moment of calculated indifference, I casually switched the phone to speaker mode and continued eating my breakfast while my father's voice erupted in a torrent of angry shouting. I could hear my mother's frantic attempts in the background, desperately trying to calm him down and restore some semblance of civility to the conversation. I must admit, there was something almost amusing about the entire spectacle for the first few minutes, watching this grown man completely lose control over a situation that was entirely of his own making. However, the entertainment value quickly diminished when my father began hurling accusations that made absolutely no logical sense. He started claiming that I had been using them financially for years, essentially treating them like my personal ATM machine. This accusation left me completely bewildered because, as I tried to explain to him, I had literally been a child for the vast majority of my life. As my parents, they were not only morally but also legally obligated to provide for my basic needs and well-being. The idea that they were somehow doing me extraordinary favors by allowing me to live in their house and providing me with food was absolutely ridiculous. The truth was that they had already neglected me emotionally throughout my entire childhood, creating a cold and distant atmosphere that left me feeling unwanted and unloved. Had it not been for legal requirements and social expectations, I was convinced they would have gladly neglected me financially as well, perhaps even going so far as to completely ignore my existence and leave me to somehow survive on my own as a child. I made it crystal clear to my father that his accusation of financial manipulation was completely unfounded and illogical. Until just a few days prior to this conversation, I had still been legally classified as a minor, which meant that supporting me financially was not an optional gesture of goodwill on their part. It was a fundamental parental responsibility that they were required to fulfill regardless of their personal feelings. Even during those years when they were legally obligated to support me, I had made tremendous efforts to minimize any financial burden I might place on them. I would consistently use my own hard-earned savings from my part-time job to purchase things I needed, even for something as basic as a new pair of sneakers. Ever since I had started working at the office supply store during my high school years, I had been doing everything within my power to become as financially self-sufficient as possible. I deliberately tried to make myself scarce around the house, hoping to minimize any potential inconvenience or irritation my presence might cause them. Despite all these efforts to accommodate their obvious reluctance to parent me, nothing I did ever seemed to satisfy them. They continuously demanded more and more from me, as if my very existence was an ongoing burden that they were forced to bear. What started as a tense conversation quickly devolved into an absolutely brutal verbal assault from both of my parents. The argument became increasingly vicious, with both my father and mother hurling insults and accusations at me with a level of cruelty that left me emotionally devastated. By the time I finally found the strength to disconnect the call, I felt completely shattered and broken inside. The aftermath of that phone call left me in a state of emotional turmoil that I had never experienced before. I felt utterly alone and overwhelmed, struggling to process the harsh reality of how my own parents truly viewed me. I desperately wanted to reach out to someone for support and comfort, but I was hesitant to disturb my friend who had already been so incredibly generous by allowing me to stay in his home without paying any rent. Given that he worked late shifts and needed to sleep in during the mornings, I felt it would be selfish and inconsiderate to burden him with my emotional crisis. In my moment of deepest despair, I realized there was only one place I could turn: the two people who had consistently shown me unconditional love and support throughout my entire life. When I called my grandparents, they answered almost immediately, as if they had been waiting by the phone. The moment I heard their familiar, caring voices, I completely broke down in tears, unable to control the flood of emotions that had been building up inside me. Through my sobs, I managed to recount the entire horrific conversation I had just endured with my parents. As I shared each painful detail, I could sense my grandparents' growing anger and disappointment with how their own daughter and son-in-law had treated me. Their voices carried a tone of determination as they assured me that they would find a way to fix this situation, though they didn't elaborate on what exactly they had in mind. I didn't press them for details about their plans, partly because I was too emotionally drained to ask probing questions, but mostly because I had complete faith that whatever course of action they chose would be appropriate and just. I knew my grandparents well enough to understand that they wouldn't attempt some misguided reconciliation effort. They were far too wise and understanding to force me back into a toxic situation with my parents. Although they remained deliberately vague about their specific intentions, the serious and somewhat ominous tone in their voices made it clear that they were not planning anything pleasant for my parents. I could tell that they were absolutely furious about how I had been treated, and they were prepared to take decisive action to address this injustice. Honestly, I found myself feeling a strange sense of anticipation and excitement about whatever consequences my parents were about to face for their cruel and heartless behavior. So 2 days ago, I told my grandparents about the very horrible phone call with my parents, and they told me that they would fix the situation. If you guys remember, well, they finally fixed it today, and I've got to say, I wasn't expecting this. They made a post on social media talking about how my parents had taken money from them for years on end just to be able to put food on the table while I was a child, and yet they seemed to have no gratitude for that and even had the audacity to mistreat me and treat me like a burden when their own parents had never done the same. Apparently, even the house that they lived in belonged to a friend of my grandparents who'd allowed them to live there at a lower rent, thanks to my grandpa. So, they really had no right to accuse me of using them for money when they had done the very same thing to my grandparents. When they just had me, they were well into adulthood and even had a child but were still incapable of scraping by on their own. Not only that, but I also found out that my parents would use me as an excuse to borrow excessive amounts of money from my grandparents when I was a baby. My grandparents knew that they were being scammed out of money, but they still went on giving and giving because they actually cared about their daughter. And today, they were heartbroken to learn that my mother was not even capable of doing the same for her own son and thought that her husband was somehow more important than her son. They announced what a good-for-nothing my father was back when I was a child, which is why they didn't want to invest in his business in the first place. He'd already tried to start 2 businesses when I was younger, but they didn't work, and my grandparents had to bail him out of those situations and pay off his debts. They didn't want to end up having to do that yet again, which is another reason that they backed out of the deal. So, I guess now it finally makes sense why my grandparents were so hesitant to invest in my parents' business, and it's completely fair as well. Their post has received a lot of attention from my relatives and their friends, and I think I'm going to share it so that more people can see it and know how awful my parents are. So far, I haven't received any word from my parents. I'm guessing that they've seen the post but just haven't been able to come up with an adequate response to it because all of it is true. After all, I bet they regret being so heartless with me on the phone the other day. Had they just let me go peacefully, then they wouldn't have so much to deal with. Well, it's been a week since my grandparents posted, and pretty much the entire family has cut my parents off. My grandparents told me that they got into a huge fight with my parents that evening after my mother showed up with my father at their house. They came there to confront my grandparents and make them take that post down somehow, but my grandparents weren't bothered in the slightest and stood their ground because they knew that they were the reason my parents even had the audacity to come and confront them like this. Obviously, they were pretty nasty toward my grandparents as well and cursed them out pretty badly, but my grandparents didn't take it too hard because they knew that this was exactly what they could expect from people like them. They've been relentlessly trying to get that post down and have even sent my grandpa a defamation lawsuit because they're losing business due to that post, which has gained a lot of attention by now. I will literally never understand how my parents managed to take everything and then blame it on somebody else instead of just taking accountability for once in their lives. I think that they're physically incapable of acknowledging that they messed up and apologizing for it. They haven't contacted me yet, which I think is a good sign because it means that they're finally done bothering me. I've also spoken to my friend because recently I found an apartment that I could share with 2 roommates, and the rent was minimal, so I could afford it. I talked to him about moving out, but to my surprise, he told me that I could live with him for as long as I needed to. Apparently, he'd read the post that I shared, And he strongly believed that I should be saving money for the future because my parents were never going to come around and start helping me. They would always do their best to drag me down. He was a couple of years older than me and had already been working for almost a year. He received allowances from his parents every now and then, so he could very well afford to let me live with him for the time being. I'm super grateful that I made a friend like this because people like him are really hard to find in today's dog-eat-dog world. I guess I lucked out in the department of having great grandparents and friends.